Thank you everyone for joining for another master class today. Today is the day that I invited Daniel Yusufian to join us. He's a paralegal working in GTA with many, many years of experience going through anything you can. I have a conversation with Daniel on a weekly basis, sometimes on a daily basis, and he explained the issues that I could never even imagine. And he's going through all of those. He's well trained and has many years of experience on that one. So let us start our today masterclass by introducing this session that names what is next when tenant doesn't pay the rent. And believe me, this market, we're going to go through that and we have to ask ourselves, what should we do next? And that's exactly why Daniel is here. Now, along the way, as you remember, I have a YouTube channel. Many of these master classes are recorded already, or the new one's going to go there. And there are a lot of information if you want to use that YouTube channel. I also have accountability calls on Monday, 8:30 to 9. Role play is 9 to 9:30. Master classes, of course, every Thursday at 10 o'clock. There are some trainings that I prepared for whoever wants to use it. That is due to a lot of requests of what we can do. For instance, there's door knocking that is recorded and is a class that you can take. There is one for video and for real estate investment. We also have our WhatsApp group that all the agents who are interested in WhatsApp, they get together and interested in door knocking, they get together in that WhatsApp group. And there are a lot of resources that I share with everybody else, supports, help, training, and so on. So open the floor for our friend, Daniel. Daniel, let me just deactivate my screen here. And I want you to, first of all, introduce yourself, see what you do and what is your expertise, and then take it from there on. Go ahead.
Good morning, everyone, and good morning, Ashton. I hope everyone is well today. I hope you already had a wonderful morning. And my name is Daniel Yusefian Amerikis, and thanks for having me today. I'm a licensed paralegal. I've worked uh, over years on landlord and tenant board cases, small claims court cases, speeding tickets. But my major area of practice is landlord and tenant board because of the current issues and because of the friends. They recommend a lot of LTB cases to me. I'm going to refer to the landlord and tenant board as an LTB. So, yeah, I'm here. If you have any questions, if I can help at any way, I'd be more than happy to do that.
All right. So what should we do? That I get a call from the landlord, from my client, say, listen, the tenant doesn't pay. Actually, I had a recent case. The tenant stopped paying from March, I think. I said, why are you calling so late? Usually, as I've heard, it is within a few days after they don't pay, you give them a notice. So can you take us through that? If a tenant doesn't pay, what should we do?
Sure. Can I share my screen?
Yeah, let me just. Okay, you should be able to share your screen now.
Let me see if I have it here. Okay, just for your reference, I've launched my website a few years ago. So this is how it looks like. And if anyone likes, you can go and read the website. And I've started to add some, topics as like bad faith claims and non-payment of rent. And I will add more and more to that website, hopefully. So one of the most interesting topics nowadays, and since before, it was the non-payment of rent. What should we do if the tenant is not paying rent? As you know, Ashton, a lot of people that they're buying the property, they are counting on the rent to pay their mortgage. There is a huge liability. We need to understand that the tenant is not responsible for the landlord's mortgage. So if I want to start with something, I want to give this advice that I give to every landlord. tell your client to have 3 to 6 months' mortgage in their pocket, if not even a year. If they can't afford that, don't buy an investment property. Don't rent it out. Nowadays, we are looking at huge delays, and it's better after COVID. It's way better than what it was before, but it's still, we are looking at a huge delay that I will explain later. Don't count on the tenant to pay your mortgage. The banks doesn't know the tenant. They know you. So this is what I wanted to start with. But what happens next if the tenant doesn't pay the rent? I'm sure most of the people here, they know what to do, but it's not what to do, it's how to do it. First thing is a notice that we need to serve a tenant. First, I recommend to have a conversation with the tenant. Most of the cases, there are some tenants that they have been there for a while, they're paying the rent on time, on and off, but they're paying the rent. Talk to the tenant, see if they have any concerns, if they are in any financial trouble or struggle, because that's very important. Because if you don't approach this property, it may irritate the situation. The first thing, if you're sure that they're not able to pay the rent or they are not going to pay the rent, you can give them an N4 notice the day after the rent is due. For example, if the tenant is paying the rent the first date of each month, you can give them an N4 for what is remaining the second day of each month. For example, if the rent is $2,000, if the tenant doesn't pay the $2,000, you're gonna put $2,000 on the notice. If they pay $1,500 and the remaining is $500, you can still give them an N4. It's not that you can't give them an N4. If the rent is not paid on the first thing that the landlord needs to do is filling out and serving them an N4. And then the tenant will have a minimum of 14 days, depending on how you serve it. For example, if it's by mail, it's 19 days minimum that the tenant either has to pay the rent or vacate the property. Some people may reach the landlord, and I recommend open communications all the time. Talk to the tenant, talk to the landlord, tell them what's going on, and tell them your concerns respectfully. Don't be mad, don't be angry, don't overreact. Financial problems happens to everyone, especially nowadays. So if the tenant is not paying the rent, after you've served the N4, you're eligible to apply to the landlord and tenant board. So, but you have to wait for that period of time. You have to wait for that 14, 15 days. You have to wait for that 19 days, depending, there are rules for each notice. After you wait, you can file an application with the landlord and tenant board. There are some requirements. The N4 notice has to be done correctly. If the N4 is not done properly, then the application is not going to be heard, is going to be dismissed. So the technicality matters. It's not just a form. There are a lot of things sitting behind that form. So that's why I always recommend people to get legal help, legal advice from paralegals, from lawyers, from legal clinics. Do the notices properly. And then they can file the application with the certificate of service to the landlord and tenant board, showing how they have served that notice. After that, they can choose their hearing date. There's an interesting option nowadays that people, they can choose their hearing dates for the L1 applications. This is called an L1 application, and it's specifically for non-payment of rent. After you choose the date, which is not, I don't believe nowadays we are looking at least 3 months waiting period to 4 months to get a hearing date. So we have to wait. We have to still be in communication with the tenant to make sure that we can arrange a payment plan. We can't say, oh, if you can't afford it today, I'm gonna evict you anyhow. No, we have to offer them a payment plan to see how they can work it out. Remember, it's their home, they're living there. So we have to accommodate their payment plan. If they don't pay the rent and if there is no accommodation, then we have to send to the LTB an updated form about non-payment of rent, how much they owe until today. So after we have all of our evidence, we have the applications, we have the update sheet, and we have the total package, and we serve it to the other side, and we file it with the landlord and tenant board. We can go to the hearing. We can still mediate over there. There is an option for mediation because sometimes people may say, "Oh, I'm gonna pay you today. I'm gonna pay you 10,000 today, the rest I'm gonna pay 1,000 each month." If that's the approach that we want, I always recommend mediation. Then, if none of these work, we're gonna go to the hearing, and a member from LTB will hear our matter, and then they will issue their decision. And this is the whole application process. They're gonna hear how much the rent arrears are, why the tenant didn't pay the rent, and if they are still satisfied the tenant can't afford the place and they're not gonna be able to pay the rent, most likely we are looking at an eviction order from the landlord and tenant board. Are there any questions about the board up until now?
I have a question.
Tell me.
Uh, we have some people called professional tenants. They
Okay.
play with the timing. Oh, okay, today I'm gonna pay $50, the other $100 gonna be next week, and
Mm-hmm.
they drag it. When even
Okay.
you send them, you serve them T1, L1, then they can go to the court, say, okay, you know what, I had an accident, I'm psychologically damaged, whatever, divorce, then give me a little bit more time, and I promise to pay extra $1,000 every month. Then they drag it, and then is the process gonna take again after reset for another 3 months hearing or no?
Okay, that's a good point. With professional tenants, we have to be careful because they have no intention to pay the rent. And that's why landlords, they need a good realtor to do this screening for them. A lot of people, they want to save money, but it's not gonna save them a lot of money. They're gonna be at loss. I'm gonna mention about some websites that you can just check and do the screening. One of the important thing, as you know, which is in your area, is doing the credit check, calling their employment and making sure that they can afford the rental unit. But the second thing is the open room website. A lot of landlords, they post these LTB orders that they had with these kind of tenants on that website. So everyone can go and see what's happening. Is that person listed as a tenant who's not paying rent or not? And the second resource is front lobby. And I recommend landlords to do this even before the tenancy starts, because by having the tenant's consent, you can have them to be registered and you can report their payments. Even if they're not on time, if you have their consent from the beginning, you can report that they are not on time. And if they're on time, it can help to build their credit history. So that's very important. And if we're dealing with that kind of tenant, with any kind, I recommend the landlord to start the legal process as soon as possible. Because going to LTB is not that we are going today and it's going to happen tomorrow. It's gonna take time. If you want to save time, you can still negotiate with the tenant, but do it while you're waiting for the hearing. Do it while you have your paperwork done. Don't wait. Start the legal process and tell them, listen, this is the opportunity to rectify this issue, because if they pay the rent, the application is automatically dismissed. If they pay the rent, there is no legal ground to go to the hearing. Or even if you go to the hearing, the member will say, listen, the rent is paid, the application is dismissed. And I'm talking only about non-payment of rent. I'm not talking about late payment of rent. Because there's another process that the landlord can start for late payment of rent. And it doesn't matter if the tenant is paying the rent or not. It's about timing. It's about if they're paying late or they're paying on time. So that's good to understand the distinct between these two. So if we are dealing with professional tenant and if we go to the landlord and tenant board, or if we are dealing with a regular tenant who's having some difficulty, even if the LTV gives an order that this tenant can stay, it's gonna be a conditional order. It is that the tenant has to pay the rent on time and has to pay like 500, 1000, whatever on top of the rent, and it has to be paid towards the rent arrears, what they owe the landlord. And if they don't pay on time, sure, it can cause some delay, but at the end, we can go to the landlord and tenant board and tell them, listen, we gave them a chance, and now they're not paying the rent. They're not paying the rent arrears, and I want them out. And then we're gonna have the eviction order. And that is conditional on doing everything properly, all the paperwork properly. There are deadlines. It's good to consider them.
And
And
how long does it take for eviction to happen? A month, a week?
that's a good point. Eviction usually happens. There are some urgent cases that we can file for and requesting an urgent hearing. But setting that aside, if we're looking at a normal process, the regular process, it will take about 4 to 5 months to have the eviction order, I would say, and this is the minimum. Sometimes up to a few months, 8 months. And remember, we have to, if the tenant doesn't move out, then we have to file that order with the sheriff's office at the location that the rental unit is located. For example, if we're looking for the Toronto or Newmarket Sheriff's Office, they're different. We have to take the order there to make sure it's enforceable. We can change the locks with their present. We cannot kick out the tenant ourselves. Sheriff has to be there. They're gonna send them notice. They're gonna give an appointment. And sometimes we're looking from 8 to 10 weeks delays in sheriff's office itself. So file it as soon as possible. Make sure you're in the queue to have the tenant out. So if the sheriff comes, they can change the lock. The landlord can have a locksmith changing the lock, and they will give usually 3 days, sometimes more, to the tenant to collect their belongings. So overall, I would say it takes 6 to 7 months altogether, average, but this is just an estimate. I know it's it's not fast. The premier is promising some, stuff to just facilitate the LTB hearings, but I believe it's going to take some time. So that's why I always tell the landlords to have 6 months' mortgage at least in your pocket before doing any investment.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Do we have questions from the audience?
We have a lot of questions, but I would give this opportunity to audience to ask question. I know Hale has questions all the time.
Yeah, you got me again. So, hi,
Good,
thank you so much for the very useful information.
no
There is
problem.
a situation. Um, you sold your house, so your tenant
Hmm.
has to move out,
Hmm.
and you rented your home, every room, like every room in the home you rented, right?
Hmm.
So all the renters gone except one. So
Okay.
before a closing and that he had to move out, can he legally allows to rent the other empty room or not?
Can the tenant
Tenant.
legally rent other rooms?
Yeah.
Okay, let me tell you something. So, just as a reminder, what we discussed today in the presentations or in answering any questions, none of these are legal advice. Always seek legal advice because each specific situation is different.
Right.
So, in your case, I would say I had some clients doing a rooming house, renting each room to different individuals. That is not a good idea. Sometimes landlords think they're going to be making more money, but first of all, they need a permit for that. You cannot rent a house like if you have 8 rooms, you cannot rent it to different individuals. And I'm calling from a bylaw perspective. So if they're doing it, they're at the risk that if someone doesn't vacate the property, there are two rules. Is the landlord living there or the landlord is not living there? Because sometimes if the landlord is sharing a kitchen and a bathroom with the tenant, they are roommates. They are not tenants.
Right.
There's a there's a huge distinction between a roommate and a tenant. The tenant is protected by the Residential Tenancies Act. The roommate is protected, but not by the Residential Tenancies Act. They have less legal rights, and they have rights in the other courts and other jurisdictions, maybe. But if that person is considered a tenant, and if they're just renting a room, no, they cannot rent the other rooms. That is not possible.
Right.
However, if a person is renting a house and if they're sharing rooms with other people, if and they're living in that house, that is not an issue. I don't see it as an issue. No, they cannot rent the other rooms, I would say.
Oh, okay. So maybe I should say sharing, not the room, like have other rooms, empty room, like the renter, whoever lived there as a tenant, just bring other friends or colleague or whatever in the and let them stay in the room. So so that's called sharing. The
So
is
if
allowed to do
if
that.
I if I rent a condominium that has 2 bedrooms, and if I have someone else living in another room, that is called sharing.
Yes. Okay.
Okay? But if
Yes.
I'm renting a room only in a house and the other rooms they don't belong to me, they belong to the landlord or to someone else, and I'm renting out those rooms to someone else, I don't see that possible. I don't see that to
Yeah.
have, I don't see that as a sharing. I
Okay.
don't believe that's legal.
Yeah, but they can. Okay. Yes.
They
Yes.
cannot, no. But the
Exactly.
matter is that if you're selling the house and if you're putting a clause that the house is gonna be vacant and it's gonna be empty, then your client might be at trouble if they're not leaving the place. Don't promise vacant position if you're dealing with tenants. Make
Yeah.
sure the house is gonna be vacant if you're buying or selling a house that is tenanted. You cannot promise on someone else's behalf.
Yeah.
Make
That's
sure it doesn't happen. If you're dealing with tenants, talk to the lawyer, closing lawyer, talk to a paralegal to see how you can deal with the tenant and how you can do the deal that it doesn't break down or you're not looking at a lawsuit, let's say.
So if you want to share, you still have to let landlord knows, right?
You can do that, but I don't see any rules that you have to say that, oh, I'm sharing.
Oh, because the lease is under that person's name, so then it's gonna be shouldn't be under like both names or whatever name.
No, that is,
Only
that is a different story.
okay.
Occupants and tenants are different. For example, I can rent a house from Ashton and I can have my family to live there. If if just in case, if we don't pay the rent, I'm the tenant, not my family. They have to leave if I have to leave, but they're not a tenant. They can be occupants. Not everyone is a tenant living at the house. The
Yes, I
tenant is the
understand. Yes.
person responsible for the rent. And if I'm sharing a house with my father, no, my father doesn't. He can be, but he doesn't have to be on the lease. As long as I'm living there, we are paying the rent and I'm paying the rent, we are fine.
Yes, that's I understand. I know. But at the beginning, for the agreement or lease, you say it's only you. Can you, this is another discussion open actually. Can you bring your family live there then? Or do you have to
Yeah.
say, you know, landlord, I'm responsible for the rent, but for example, my cousin, my parents, my sister, is gonna be living. So would landlord has a right to know how many people is gonna be living in the house?
If it's exceeding the legal limit, I would say yes. Some questions that I'm answering uh, you know, without doing any research, right? I
Mhm.
don't I don't remember all of the laws, but from what I know, no, I don't have to tell the landlord, oh, for example, I'm getting married and my wife will come next week. I'm renting the entire house, right? I'm not, and I'm paying for the entire house. So it doesn't matter how many people they're living there, unless the number of people living there it exceeds the legal limit. For example, if 15 people is there living in a small basement, then that is the violation of the bylaws. That is different. But for example, if I'm renting a house and if my wife will join me, like for example, next year or whatever, I don't have to tell anyone.
Oh, I see. Okay. I thought because I was always telling my tenant that if anybody else gonna join later on, it's good to let your landlord knows that
It is good, but I don't
you don't
see
have
that
to.
as an obligation.
Oh,
Maybe I'm wrong. I have to double check, but I don't see that as an obligation.
I see. Okay. Okay. And that was I was thinking differently. Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you.
No problem.
Daniel, I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Um, some of the landlords in the past I've heard they were using utilities as a tool to evict the tenant. I know that's illegal.
Okay.
Uh, that's why I always recommend my landlord to not um, take the charge of paying the utilities, because if
Okay.
they don't pay utilities, it's all coming back to the landlord. Landlord has to pay because originally accepted the responsibility. Now, if the landlords decided to shut down the utilities, I
Hmm.
know the tenant can complain, but how would the
Yes.
process of complaining would take place? Let's say I'm the landlord, I don't want to pay utilities to push them to leave the place. They go to police or they go to LTB to complain.
They can complain to landlord and tenant board, but there is a housing standard safety and something. I don't remember the name exactly. I don't have it on top of my mind, but they can complain there and they're gonna be quick with in order to oversee that complaint
Okay.
because having the vital service in the house is very important. You cannot You cannot say, oh, I'm not providing the heat because you're not paying rent. It's true that not they're not doing their obligations towards paying the rent, but it doesn't mean that the landlord has to just shut down the utilities. No, vital services, they have to be there. We
Okay.
have to make sure that it's there. Otherwise, the tenant can complain and say, listen, because of these issues, I wasn't able to pay the rent because I didn't have full reasonable enjoyment of that property. For example, if we have a pool in the property and if the pool is not functioning, or if the roof is leaking, the tenant can come and say, listen, I'm paying a full rent for something that is not properly working. They might be able to get some, we call it abatement, general damages from the landlord. So we have to make sure that the property is in good state of maintenance and repair, and we have to make sure that the utilities are there.
Okay, I've heard of this landlord kept the basement for himself, just rented the second floor, and then when the tenant doesn't pay, he occupy the basement and start making so much noise and bothering somehow the upper floor, the tenant, just to
Yeah.
evict. Is that a strategy that he did, or would it work?
That is absolutely not a strategy. I believe some people they do it. Some people they overreact. As soon as you just bother them or you do not pay the rent, they become, oh, why? I just have to evict them myself. They don't respect the legal channels. They don't respect the laws. And they're gonna be in trouble at the end because as long as the tenant is in position, they can have call the police, they can call the for example the city because of the issues. The landlord can get a ticket, or if they're living in a basement that is not legal, they can have an order to comply issued against them. I don't recommend that. And at the end, they're going to look bad in front of the landlord and tenant board member for the things that they're doing, right? I always say, let's keep the peace and show that we are doing our best, but the other side, they're not paying attention to their financial obligations. That's what I always recommend. Because, Ashton, if we are prepared to be a landlord, we are prepared. We are not just buying a property. Oh, buy this property, just rent the main floor and the basement. And most of the time, that basement is not even a legal unit to rent. Oh, and it's gonna pay for the mortgage, and you're gonna have the property after 25 years. You're gonna have a $2 to $3 million property for your retirement. It's not always like that. It's a life thing. It requires maintenance, doesn't always pay for the mortgage. It doesn't cover. Most of the time, there are some exceptions, but most of the properties, they don't pay for all of the fees and the costs. They pay for the portion of it. It's an investment if you can afford, if you can get the rent from the tenant, and if you can add on the top, it's a good investment. But the landlord needs to have the ability to maintain the property or have a property manager or have someone to take care of the property. Things happen. Sometimes people, the renters, they are not bad people. For example, if someone is working in construction, we all know that the market, it's not good for them for the last 2 years. So they may come up with some issues with paying the rent. They're not always the bad people. I'm not talking about professional tenants that you're already categorized them. Professional tenant means someone has no intention whatsoever to pay the rent. But we don't have a lot of them. We may still encounter with these kind of people, but we don't always have these kind of people. Sometimes it's just a misunderstanding. Oh, I don't want you here. The lease is up. You have to leave. Sometimes our actions, they lead the tenant not paying the rent, right? So we have to make sure we understand the laws. We are always in good communication. We take care of the property and we do what's in our best interest and let them to pay the rent, let them to have peace because it's their home. Remember, it's our property, but it's their home. Remember this, and you have to respect that. It's not that, oh, I'm the owner, I can do whatever I like with this property. No, someone else is paying for that, right? So always keep that in mind that, for example, if the tenant is not able to pay the rent for a few months because of, an injury, because of an accident, because of the market situation, they may rectify that issue because they need a place to live, right? So that's why first go to a lawyer or paralegal, know your legal rights. Don't wait from March up until now because again, you're gonna have to wait. You're no different than the other people. The waiting time starts from the day that we file the application, not from the day that the tenant doesn't pay the rent.
Okay.
Any other questions?
You mentioned
Yes.
two sites, front lobby, and what was the next one?
Open room.
Open room. And these are legal to like with people's privacy? Is it okay? Is no
It's
issue?
not a privacy. Usually the orders, they are public records.
Okay.
So I don't see that. If it's a privacy, for example, if it's a used criminal thing, you're not gonna see that and no one is allowed to share that, right? But landlord and tenant board, seek legal advice, but I don't believe that's an issue. If you have an order against the tenant, I don't see that as an issue.
Okay. A
Ashton, I
question.
have a question. Ashton,
Yes?
can I go ahead?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, so talking about the quiet enjoyment about the tenant, yes, they have their rights and the landlord has their rights too. But my question is that if tenant does not pay the rent, the next options or the question could be that sometime the landlord is asking about the rent and the tenant is not paying the rent. It turns out to be an argument, and the argument can turn into a
Sorry, I didn't hear
aggressive
your.
behavior.
Let me quickly
Okay.
change my connection because it's saying that I'm having issue with my internet connection.
Okay,
Sorry about that, guys.
it's okay. Let me know when you are ready.
Sure, just give me a second. Let me switch my connection.
Yeah.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah.
certainly I can hear you. And
Yeah.
here is my question that since it's a question, we are discussing a question about non-payment of rent. And
Okay.
I'm saying that it can start with an argument by the tenant and the landlord about the non-payment of rent. And
Okay.
it can turn up into an argument, and the argument can turn up into a bad behavior or maybe aggressive behavior.
Right.
And I believe the situation is that now the situation is that it's a kind of an offensive situation, and
Mhm.
now the landlord and tenant are, maybe you can use the terminology of hand to hand.
Yeah.
Now the question here is that is there any chance or any way that the landlord can call the police or the tenant can call the police to resolve this matter?
Absolutely. The thing is that if it's the part that the police has to be involved, absolutely. Because not everything goes to the landlord and tenant board. I have a landlord that they were having some difficulty with the tenant, and especially the landlords that they live in the same property. Sometimes there's a building that has 3 rental units and the landlord is living there, or the landlord is living upstairs or in the basement. So they can call the police, and if there is a physical assault or whatever it is, the police will investigate. And if they have to charge someone and lay criminal charges, they will do that. So we have to make sure that doesn't happen, because I had this kind of situation that the landlord was having problems with the tenant, and because they didn't address it on time and properly, they were in the situation that they had to deal with some criminal charges, even though that they were claiming that they did nothing and it was a setup, but still they have to respond to that. They have to answer the questions. If they have to show up in any court, they have to show up in the court. So that doesn't matter. Always try to keep the peace. Always try to stay out of any trouble. That's my recommendation. And that happens when you have backup. If you have backup for the bad day, you're gonna be like safe. But if you're not gonna have any backups, if you're buying a property, having a line of credit, having a second line of credit, having a second mortgage, asking just some money from the people that you know, buying the property and counting only on the tenant, that is the biggest mistake that the people do, that the landlords do. They're counting on other people and they're making themselves responsible. It's evicting a tenant, it's not gonna happen in a night. So be prepared for it. You can't go out with a t-shirt in minus 30 degrees in Canada, right? You have to be prepared for it. So it's the same thing. Always. Some agents may say, oh, if I tell these things to my client, they're not gonna buy the property. They're not gonna do any real estate transactions with me. That's not true. If you're being truthful with your client, that's gonna tell them that you're an honest person, you're knowledgeable, and you want to you care about their interests, you care about their money, you care about their investments. If they can't buy a property that it's $1 million, they might be still interested to save 200K in their pocket and go for a property that it's 800K, right? And if they're safe, they're going to be able to do another investment with you. They're going to be able to recommend some friends. You may lose one client that day, but you're going to gain a lot of clients in the long run. Because I have a lot of calls from landlords. Oh, my agent didn't tell me this. My agent didn't tell me that. Oh, she said I can have the position back anytime. There are some unprofessional people out there, and they're giving wrong advice to the people. So that's why you need to educate yourself and educate your client, because the first thing they're gonna do, they're gonna come to you. Oh, Ashton, this is what happened, right? And you have to say, oh, you have to either involve yourself, which is not recommended, and you have to recommend them to a legal professional. And when they come to us, they're gonna see the delays. They're not gonna be happy. So always prepare your client for the worst. So if nothing happens, they're safe. If something happens, they're not gonna be troubled a lot. They're gonna be at financial loss, but they're not gonna lose their investment.
Okay, so can I have another question, Aston? Yes or no?
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Okay.
If that's okay for
Okay. Well,
Dan.
certainly I'll be quick. I got a point from you that, you know, if you are buying a couple of properties and you are relying on the tenants to pay your mortgage, perhaps, then what about having a property manager to look after your properties? Let's say you pay a kind of a salary or wages to your property manager and ask your property manager to deal with your affairs and you stay back.
At the end, I don't see that property manager to be responsible for the non-payment of rent,
Okay.
right?
Okay.
I've heard that there are some rent payment insurance that the landlords they can buy, just in case if the tenant doesn't pay the rent, the insurance will have to cover. But
Mhm.
the landlords, they have to do a lot of research about those companies and about those insurances. It can be good, and sometimes they might not pay because there's a pre-existing condition. You know how insurance works, right? So I believe if they want to pay the extra dollar to those insurance companies, having an insurance like that is advisable, but I believe if the landlord has some money in their pocket, always saved just in case if something emergency like this happens, that is the best solution.
Thank you.
And if, listen, even if the landlords they have the property for their own, you know, if they can't work for a while, if they're unemployed, they're gonna have issues with paying the mortgage, right? It's the same
Mhm.
thing. It's not different than that. People they have to have emergency funds in their pockets all the time. I know a lot of people don't, but that's how it should be.
Yeah.
There is a question on chat said, if the tenant is not cooperating with showing process, is there anything shall be done? My personal answer to this here is to keep relationship very well, at least for you as an agent with that tenant. I had cases that I have to drive all the way from Mississauga to Aurora for every single showing, literally beg the tenant who was not that fluent in English to allow one more showing to happen, which I sold it. But keeping a good relationship with tenant, at least you as a middle person, is crucial. But Daniel, is there anything based on LTB or paralegal aspect that can help with this showing process as a right to tenant or right to landlord?
Ashton, I would say we have discussed it in selling a tenanted property in a different session, and that I believe we had a lot of information in that session that any real estate agent they need to go and just watch that 1 hour session, I would say. But if I want to be quick with this answer, we can issue an notice to the tenant and take them to landlord and tenant board, but that may take also a while. We can do that, and in the meanwhile, we can just tell them to listen. The landlord can, for example, can't afford the property anymore. And if you want to stay in this property, if you want the new owner to just have you here, you need to cooperate. We need to have them understand what's going on, and having a good relationship, it would help. But some people they don't allow the showings, and again we have to take them to landlord and tenant board for that.
Okay, one last question, very quickly.
And sorry, Ashton, make sure to give proper notice of entry to the tenant, because if we don't do that, at the end we're going to be liable for illegal entries maybe.
Here is my next question linked with what you just said. Is N9 mandatory for a tenant or can refuse as long as he gave a 60 days notice to the landlord? Landlord sent N9, but he said, I don't need to sign it. Can he do that?
You know, usually the notices they are very well prepared on the landlord and tenant board's website, and those are the notices that we should use. However, if there is another notice that is in compliance with the Residential Tenancy Act, that is fine, but we can, if there is an issue, then we can say, listen, this is the tenant didn't give me a proper notice, and I didn't know whether they're gonna leave or not. So yeah, it can be an issue from that point. But we need to make sure that just tell them to get legal advice, and there should be no issue with the tenant giving the N9 unless they don't want to give that 60-day notice.
Okay. All right. Anyone that has any other questions?
Yes, I do. Could I ask?
Yeah, Isaac, you can ask the question. Meanwhile, Daniel, can you put your phone on the screen? And
My phone number?
Yes.
Yeah, it's just right here. My
Okay, that's
website
great.
is wirelesslegalservices.ca. My phone number is 647-544-3247.
Okay.
You can
And
call me anytime. It doesn't have to be the office hours. If I can take your call, I will answer that. Send me a text message always, because sometimes I'm in the hearing, I'm with the client, and sometimes I miss the phone calls. Leave me a detailed message with text and I'll get back to you.
thank you. Isaac, go ahead.
Okay, yes, I have a property is upstairs is one tenant, downstairs another tenant, and the basement apartment is go through the garage to go in. And
Okay.
I told the tenant like the garage is not for storage, it's just for you to access the basement. And I found out like the whole garage, he put all the stuff there. I asked them to remove it a couple times. They don't do anything. And the other thing is, I said like the left side parking is for basement, right side is for upstairs. But because of upstairs, there is no car, and they save it for the visitor to come, right? But the basement always park car on upstairs side. What can I do? I asked them to like move it, and I think I served them the N5, something like
Yeah,
the interfere the enjoyment, right? But like,
right.
but they like they just like behave for 1-2 months, and then like they do it again, right? So what can I do? Could I put a car
If
off to lock their tire?
no, you can't. You have to take them to landlord and tenant board, have an order against them, and you may need to give them a new N5. It has to be detailed. Make sure that the N5 is done properly. And if everything looks good, then you can, if they don't comply, or if this is a second N5 or third N5, then you can take them to landlord and tenant board and either have an eviction order or a conditional order that they rectify that issue.
Oh, okay. So even the garage, they put all the stuff there, I still couldn't do anything, right?
So you can take them to landlord and tenant board.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
No problem.
Any last question? Any last question, 2? Any last question, 1? Thank you, Daniel, for joining us today. It was great to have you here. And
Thanks for having me.
And the phone number is on the screen. Anyone who likes to call Daniel, he's a great paralegal. He works and he go extra mile to help you as much as he could. And it was an honor to have you here. Hopefully we can look to have you more here with some other issues regarding tenant and landlords in the near future.
My pleasure. It's always good to talk to you, Ashton, and I know you do a lot to educate the people, to educate your clients. That's wonderful and that's great. And if you want, we can have the next session for understanding the bad faith claims, because most of the times when we are buying or selling the property, we're going to be dealing with this issue. If the property is tenanted, we want to protect ourselves and we want to protect our client from being sued for a bad faith claim.
Okay, that's great. So we're going to coordinate that one. And thank you very much again for joining, and have a wonderful day. And to all of you real estate agents, go work hard.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye.
Yes.